A 10-year-old girl begging at the airport is moved when a millionaire gives her $20. Watching through the window, she suddenly sees the man collapse to the ground, unable to breathe, desperately struggling for help. The little girl breaks into the airport and, with everyone in panic, grabs a pen from his pocket and pierces the millionaire's throat. Minutes later, something sad happens. The Friday morning air smelled of coffee cake and freshly cut grass, a sweet blend that usually made Leah's heart lift. But today, the scent only churned her stomach. The grounds of Willow Creek Elementary were decked out with colorful balloons and crepe paper streamers, a scene of contagious joy that seemed to mock the tight knot in her throat. Children dashed everywhere, pulling along men of all ages, some in suits, others in work uniforms, but all sharing the same sparkle in their eyes, the pride of being a father. The traditional Father's Day celebration was about to begin, and 7-year-old Leah, in her faded cotton dress, felt like the most invisible person in the universe. She had spent the entire week spinning the most elaborate of her stories. To her classmates, her father was an important man, an adventurer who traveled the world building bridges and discovering treasures. He was strong, brave, and most importantly, he loved her more than anything. "He's coming," she repeated to herself like a mantra, watching the school entrance, her small, sweaty hands twisting the hem of her dress. But the gate opened and closed, revealing more and more dads, and none of them was the hero of her fantasies. The truth, bitter and cold, was that Leah had no father. She never had. Her best friend, Chloe, ran up to her, her face radiant, holding hands with a tall, smiling man wearing a straw hat. "Leah, this is my dad. Dad, this is Leah. Her dad should be arriving any minute too, right?" Leah forced the most convincing smile she could manage, an effort that made her cheeks ache. "Yes, he called me. Had a little business snag, you know, grown-up stuff, but he promised he won't miss the sack race." Chloe's father smiled gently at her, a look mixing kindness with a hint of pity that made Leah shrink inward. They moved away, and she was alone again, a small island of solitude in a sea of familial happiness. The teacher, Mrs. Albright, clapped her hands, her animated voice echoing over the makeshift sound system. "Attention, dear parents and students. In 5 minutes, we're starting our first field day event, the 3-legged race. Find your partners." Panic surged up Leah's throat like a cold wave. 5 minutes. That was the time she had left before her lie collapsed, and everyone saw her for what she truly was, the only child without anyone. Her eyes swept the gate one last time, a silent, desperate prayer. It was then that she saw him, across the street. A black sedan, so shiny it looked like a polished jewel under the morning sun, pulled smoothly up to the curb. A man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit stepped out. He didn't look like an ordinary father. There was a distinct aura of power and expensive calm about him. He glanced at his wristwatch, the gesture elegant and precise, and then turned toward the car door, as if about to leave. An absurd idea, born of pure desperation, exploded in Leah's mind. It was madness, complete and utter madness. But what was crazier? Talking to a complete stranger, or facing the humiliation of standing there alone while everyone pointed and whispered. Without a second thought, driven by a force she didn't know she possessed, she bolted across the grounds. She ignored Mrs. Albright's calls, the sound of laughter, the entire world. There was only that man, and the last flicker of hope she had left. With her heart hammering against her ribs, she raced toward the gate, her small feet barely touching the asphalt. The man was about to open the car door when he heard a trembling voice behind him, a thread of sound carrying all the hope and despair in the world. "Mister..." The man turned, and for an instant, Leah's world stopped. He was even more imposing up close. The grey suit seemed spun from moonlight, and his leather shoes gleamed so brightly they reflected the blue sky. His face was serious, with fine lines around his eyes that suggested both preoccupation and authority. They were the eyes of a man accustomed to commanding, to making decisions that could move fortunes in a single afternoon. For a second, Leah almost retreated, intimidated by that aura of wealth and authority. But then the sound of Mrs. Albright's voice announcing the start of the three-legged race reached her, a cruel reminder of what awaited her if she failed. She took a deep breath, the smell of dust and flowers mixing in her lungs, and summoned every ounce of courage in her small body. The words came out in a whisper, tumbling over each other, charged with an urgency that came from the depths of her soul. "Mister, can you be my dad for the school party? All the other dads came but mine. Please." She clasped her hands in front of her chest, a gesture of supplication she'd learned watching the ladies at church. The tears she had been holding back finally overflowed, tracing dirty paths down her dusty cheeks. She didn't dare look him in the eyes, fixing her gaze instead on the blue silk tie he wore, a small point of color in her grey world. Every second of silence that followed felt like an eternity, an overwhelming weight on her fragile shoulders. She could feel the curious stares of other children and parents turning toward the unusual scene at the school gate. Alexander Sterling, a man whose net worth was debated in financial columns and whose stock market decisions could build or destroy empires, felt something shift inside him. His schedule was jammed. In 15 minutes, he had a video conference with investors in Zurich to discuss the allocation of significant capital into new cryptocurrencies. It was a deal that could yield millions in profit, adding another layer to his already vast fortune. His mind, trained to think in assets and liabilities, in risk and profitability, screamed at him to get in the car and be on his way. But his eyes were fixed on the tiny figure in front of him. There was an authenticity to that desperation, a purity in the girl's pain that disarmed all his defenses. For a brief moment, the image of another pair of long-lost childhood eyes flashed in his memory, an old wound that never completely healed. He slowly crouched down, meeting Leah at her height. A gesture that took him off his pedestal of power and placed him in her world. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not harsh as she feared, but soft, almost hesitant. "What's your name, little one?" "Leah," she replied, her voice choked with tears. He nodded, his gaze sweeping the schoolyard, the vibrant celebration, and then returning to her tear-stained face. A decision formed, one that defied all business logic but felt like the only right thing to do in the universe. He stood up. "Leah," he said, with a new firmness in his voice. "Wait here, just 1 minute, don't move." Without further explanation, he turned, got into the luxurious car, and closed the door with a soft click. Leah stood paralyzed, watching the car pull away down the street, the engine a silent purr that soon disappeared. The hope that had flourished so intensely in her chest withered and died. He had abandoned her, just like everyone else. The tears now fell freely, silent sobs shaking her body as the crushing certainty that she was, and always would be, completely alone, enveloped her like a cold blanket. Leah's world collapsed into a deafening silence. The joyful sound of the party, the cheerful music, the laughter of the other children, everything turned into a distant, indistinct noise, like the buzzing of an insect. She remained there, a statue of disappointment by the school gate, while the tears traced clean paths down her dusty face. She felt foolish, a simpleton for having believed, even for a single, fleeting second, that a miracle could happen to her. Miracles were for the children in the stories her grandma told, not for girls like her, who wore patched dresses and whose only precious possession was a one-eyed rag doll. The humiliation burned inside her, hotter than the midday sun. Now everyone would know the truth. The liar, the orphan, Mrs. Albright, with her sharp eyes and generous heart, noticed the small, huddled figure near the gate. She approached with soft steps, the gentle smile on her face trying to calm the storm she knew was brewing in the girl's heart. "Leah, honey, what are you doing here alone? Come on, come help me organize the prizes for the ring toss. You're so good at that." It was an offer of mercy, an attempt to save her from imminent shame. Leah just shook her head, unable to form words. Going with the teacher meant admitting defeat, accepting her place on the margins of others' happiness. It was at that exact moment, when hope had already turned to ashes, that the same gleaming black sedan appeared again around the corner, gliding down the street with the silent elegance of a panther. It stopped in the exact same spot. Leah's heart gave such a violent leap that she thought it would escape through her mouth. The door opened and Alexander Sterling stepped out. But this time, he wasn't empty-handed. In one arm, he carried the largest, most colorful bouquet of flowers Leah had ever seen, a rainbow of roses, gerberas, and lilies. In the other, a massive wicker basket overflowing with boxes of chocolates and lollipops of all shapes and colors. For a man whose day usually involved managing a portfolio valued at hundreds of millions of dollars, that small investment in sweets and flowers was insignificant. But for the girl watching him, it seemed like he carried all the treasures of the world. He walked with a purpose Leah hadn't seen before, passing through the gate and going directly to her and Mrs. Albright, who watched the scene with an expression of complete perplexity. Alexander ignored the teacher for a moment, his focus entirely on Leah. He crouched down again, offering her the bouquet. "Flowers for the bravest girl I know," he said, his voice low and firm. Then he took a small, heart-shaped box of chocolates from the basket and placed it in her hands. "And these are just for you." Leah looked from the flowers to the chocolate, and then to his face, her eyes wide with pure disbelief. This couldn't be real. It had to be a dream. Alexander then stood up, turning to the astonished teacher. He extended his hand, the polished and confident gesture of a man accustomed to leading. "Alexander Sterling, my apologies for the delay. I'm Leah's father. I had an urgent business matter, a cash flow issue that couldn't wait." He gestured toward the basket. "I hope this helps make up for it. They're for all the kids." Mrs. Albright shook his hand mechanically, her mind trying to process the impossible information. Leah's father. But everyone knew that Leah. Before she could formulate a question, Alexander smiled, a smile that lit up his serious face and reached his eyes. He placed a gentle hand on Leah's shoulder, a protective gesture that sent an unfamiliar warmth through the girl's body. "So," he said, looking out at the lively grounds, "what did we miss?" Mrs. Albright blinked, her mind still trying to connect the image of little Leah, always so withdrawn and humble, with this man who exuded an aura of power and wealth. The basket of chocolates was the perfect distraction. The children, drawn by the shimmer of the wrappers, rushed toward them, and the teacher, relieved, began distributing the treats, creating a wave of happiness that immediately integrated Alexander and Leah into the heart of the celebration. The three-legged race was already over, but the egg and spoon race was about to start. Leah, who moments before felt like a ghost, was now the center of attention. She instinctively grabbed Alexander's hand and pulled him toward the starting line. "Come on, Dad! We're going to win!" The word "Dad" slipped from her lips with a naturalness that surprised her, sounding both strange and wonderfully right. Alexander felt like a fish out of water. He was a master in boardrooms, a predator in the world of high-risk investment, where he negotiated millions in shares and analyzed the profitability of complex funds. But here, with a plastic spoon in his mouth and an egg precariously balanced on it, he was a complete amateur. The expensive suit restricted his movements, and his Italian shoes weren't made for the uneven schoolyard grass. The other children and parents laughed, not cruelly, but with the pure amusement of the moment, and Leah laughed louder than everyone. Her laugh was like the sound of bells, clear and contagious. "Slower," she whispered, walking beside him, her small eyes fixed on the egg. "Imagine it's a gold treasure." The comparison made Alexander smile. He dealt with actual gold, with bars secured in vaults, but the concentration he dedicated to that fragile egg was somehow far more intense. He focused, blocking out the world, using the same concentration he applied to analyzing stock market fluctuations. They didn't win. The egg splattered a few steps from the finish line, much to Leah's noisy delight, but for the first time in years, Alexander didn't mind losing. The feeling of the sun on his face, the sound of the girl's laughter, the simplicity of that moment. It was an emotional dividend none of his financial applications had ever provided. They participated in everything. In the ring toss, he helped her hook a plastic fish that earned a bag of candies. In the beanbag toss, he missed every attempt, making Leah laugh until her stomach hurt. For all intents and purposes, they were father and daughter, living a perfect day. Leah felt a warmth in her chest that she had never experienced. This is what it felt like to have someone, to have a father. The looks of pity from her classmates were replaced by looks of admiration. The girl who had nobody suddenly had the most interesting dad of all. As the party began to wind down, they sat on a concrete bench beneath the shade of the old oak tree, eating slices of chocolate cake on paper plates. The silence between them was comfortable, filled only by the buzzing of bees in the flowers and the murmuring of families saying goodbye. Alexander observed Leah's face, smeared with frosting, and saw a serenity that hadn't been there before. The facade of forced bravery had vanished, replaced by a genuine, fragile happiness. He felt a pang in his heart, a need to protect that peace, but also a twitch of curiosity. He needed to understand. He wiped a corner of her mouth with his thumb, the gesture surprising both of them. "Did you have fun?" he asked gently. Leah nodded enthusiastically, her eyes sparkling. "It was the best day of my life." He smiled. "I'm glad." He paused, choosing his words with a surgeon's care. "Leah, your father, what you told me about him being an adventurer. He sounds like a very special man. Where is he now?" The question hung in the air, delicate and heavy like a lead feather. The radiant joy on Leah's face faded, replaced by a shadow of vulnerability that Alexander recognized immediately. It was the same expression he saw on young entrepreneurs before they confessed they were running out of capital. The girl's smile wavered, and her eyes, once so full of light, dropped to her worn shoes, where she traced invisible circles in the dust with the tip of her foot. The oak tree above them seemed to hold its breath, its leaves a vibrant contrast to the paleness that had taken over Leah's cheeks. She bit her lower lip, a small gesture of distress that Alexander did not miss. The fantastic storyteller, the creator of adventurous fathers, had been cornered by reality. I lied," she whispered, her voice so low that Alexander had to lean in to hear. Each word seemed to cost her immense effort, as if she were confessing the most terrible of secrets. "I don't have a dad. Never did. Or a mom. I just didn't want to be the only one alone today. I'm sorry." The tears returned, silent and bitter. Not the tears of desperation from earlier, but tears of shame. She huddled on the bench, expecting the reprimand, the disappointment, the abandonment that would surely follow. It was the pattern of her life, a brief moment of happiness followed by a painful fall. She had dared to dream, and now she would pay the price. Alexander said nothing for a long moment. He just watched her, processing the confession. There was no anger on his face, nor disappointment, just a deep and resonant sadness. He thought about his own empire, built on the foundation of numbers, facts, and logical projections. A lie in his business could cost millions, destroy reputations. But that girl's lie, it wasn't about gain or deceit. It was about emotional survival, a fragile shield against a world that could be incredibly cruel to a solitary child. He felt a wave of empathy so strong it almost took his breath away. "If you don't have a father or mother," he asked, his voice even softer, "who do you live with, Leah?" The question seemed to open a new floodgate of worry. "I live with my grandma Elsie," she said, rubbing her eyes with the backs of her hands. "But she's not my real grandma. She found me on her doorstep when I was a tiny baby. She's very old, 85, and she's sick. Her legs hurt really bad, and sometimes she forgets things." The story came out in a continuous flow, a torrent of truths she had kept bottled up. "Our house is really small, up in the heights. It leaks when it rains hard, and her social security barely covers the medicine and food. That's why she couldn't come. She can't even walk down the hill by herself anymore." The image Leah painted with her simple, direct words hit Alexander with the force of a punch. He, who lived in a luxury penthouse overlooking the entire city, who worried about the fluctuation of foreign currencies, who was considering buying a new private jet, suddenly found himself confronted with a brutal and unknown reality. An 85-year-old sick grandmother caring for a 7-year-old child in a leaky house. The juxtaposition of their lives was so stark, so unfair, that a feeling of shame settled in him. His vast wealth, his immense net worth, seemed obscene in the face of that daily struggle for simple dignity. He looked at the girl beside him, so small and already carrying such a heavy burden, and knew, with absolute certainty, that their day together wasn't over yet. The journey to Leah's house was a study in contrasts. Alexander's luxury sedan, with its soft leather seats and silent air conditioning, glided through the wide, tree-lined streets of the downtown area. But as they drove up the hill, the scenery changed drastically. Asphalt gave way to uneven cobblestones and finally to a rough dirt road. Mansions were replaced by small, unfinished houses, huddled together in precarious balance. The air grew thicker, smelling of wood smoke and damp earth. Alexander, a man accustomed to navigating the corridors of power and finance, felt like an alien in that environment. His car, a symbol of his success and assets, now seemed like vulgar ostentation, attracting curious and sometimes resentful glances from passing residents. Leah guided him with a melancholy familiarity, pointing out alleys and shortcuts. "It's just up there," she said, her voice low, as if ashamed. The house was exactly as she had described, perhaps even worse. Small, with exposed brick walls and a rust-stained zinc roof. A tiny garden in the front, despite everything, showed signs of care, with some stubborn flowers sprouting in old paint cans. Grandma Elsie greeted them at the door, leaning on a wooden cane. She was a fragile woman, with skin wrinkled like tissue paper and eyes that, though cloudy with age, shone with a fierce kindness. The interior of the house was clean, but the poverty was palpable. The furniture was old and worn, and a dark stain on the wooden ceiling confirmed the story of the leaks. While Leah excitedly recounted the party, showing the bouquet of flowers now placed in a glass bottle, Alexander spoke with the old woman. Her story was one of altruism that left him humbled. Elsie confirmed it. She found Leah, a newborn baby, abandoned in a cardboard box on her doorstep on a cold winter night. Without hesitation, she took her in, raising her as her granddaughter with the little she had. Her small social security income was all they possessed. Alexander felt an overwhelming impulse to act. That very afternoon, he arranged for a large grocery order, which was delivered to the door of the small house, much to Elsie's astonishment. In the days that followed, he became a constant, though discreet, presence in their lives. He hired contractors to fix the roof and make small repairs to the house. He spoke with a doctor, paying for a consultation and the best medications for Elsie's pain. He did everything with the efficiency of a great manager, organizing solutions like someone organizing an investment portfolio. But his presence did not go unnoticed. The neighborhood, a microcosm of lives intertwined by proximity and hardship, began to whisper. The arrival of that rich man in his imported car was an unprecedented event. Who was he? Why was he helping old Elsie and little Leah? Envy, a weed that grows quickly in the soil of scarcity, began to sprout. He must want something, a neighbor said in the bakery line. Nobody with that much money does anything for free. Another, at the corner bar, speculated maliciously. He's got his eye on the land. He wants to buy all this for next to nothing to build condos. The rumors spread like wildfire in dry grass, twisting kindness into self-interest, altruism into a sinister plan. Alexander's generosity, instead of being seen as a blessing, became suspicious. The children who used to play with Leah now looked at her sideways, repeating the whispers they heard from their parents. The first obstacle didn't come in the form of a financial or legal problem, but something much more insidious: the community's distrust. The help he offered, intended to ease the burden on Leah and her grandmother, was, ironically, isolating them even further, turning them into targets of malicious gossip. And the worst was yet to come, as someone, driven by a darker envy, decided that those rumors needed to reach official ears. An anonymous tip was made to Child Protective Services, CPS, painting a perverse picture of the rich man's true intentions with the orphaned girl. The visit arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, just as the sun was setting and painting the sky orange and purple. It wasn't the police, as some neighbors might have expected, but something that, to Alexander, seemed far more intimidating. A serious-looking woman with an ID badge hanging around her neck and eyes that seemed to see through the newly repaired walls of the small house. She introduced herself as Ms. Davis, a social worker from the Department of Family and Child Services. The anonymous complaint had taken effect, and the fragile world Alexander was trying to build for Leah was about to be examined under a cold, impersonal microscope. She was polite, but her questions were incisive, like small needles probing the most sensitive points of that unusual arrangement. Sitting in the modest living room, with a clipboard on her lap, she questioned Alexander about the nature of his investment in the family. The word she used made him recoil. To him, it was an act of compassion. To her, it seemed like a transaction to be audited. Mr. Sterling, what exactly is your relationship with the minor, Leah Alves? She asked, her pen hovering over the paper. And how do you explain this sudden and massive application of resources into her residence and well-being? Alexander tried to explain, but his words, which were so persuasive in boardrooms where he negotiated the fate of large businesses, sounded hollow and suspicious here. He spoke about the encounter at the school, about the girl's desperate plea. But to the ears of a bureaucrat trained to distrust, the story sounded like a fairy tale, a facade for something unconfessable. Leah, sensing the tension in the air, hid behind Alexander, clutching his pant leg, her eyes fixed on the strange woman. Grandma Elsie, her voice trembling, tried to defend her benefactor, calling him an angel sent by God, which only seemed to increase Mrs. Davis's skepticism. The air in the small room became thin, charged with suspicion and fear. It was then that the turning point, silent and devastating, occurred. Grandma Elsie, agitated by the pressure of the interrogation and anxious to serve the visitor a glass of water, rose from her rocking chair. Her legs, already weakened by age and illness, faltered. She took a false step on the uneven cement floor, the cane slipping from her trembling hand. The sound that followed was not loud, just a dull thud and a sharp moan of pain that cut the air like a knife. Leah screamed. Alexander rushed to the old woman's side, who lay on the floor, her face contorted in a mask of agony. Clutching her hip, chaos erupted, while Alexander, with terrified efficiency, called an ambulance. Miss Davis observed the scene, her expression transforming from professional skepticism to grave, official concern. The situation had changed drastically. It was no longer an investigation into a mysterious benefactor. It was an acute crisis. The child's sole guardian was incapacitated. The paramedics arrived quickly, maneuvering the stretcher through the narrow doorway. Leah cried hysterically, clinging to her grandmother's hand, refusing to let go. "Grandma, don't leave me. Please don't go," she sobbed, her face drenched in tears. As they prepared Grandma Elsie for transport, Miss Davis approached Alexander, her gaze firm, her voice devoid of emotion. "Mr. Sterling, the situation is clear. Mrs. Elsie requires immediate medical attention, and the girl—" She paused, looking at Leah, who was now completely alone in the middle of the room. "Given the circumstances, she cannot stay here. She will have to come with me to a temporary shelter until her situation is assessed." Mrs. Davis's words echoed in the small room with the finality of a sentence. Temporary shelter. To Alexander, accustomed to navigating legal complexities in the corporate world, the term sounded like standard procedure, but to Leah, who overheard the conversation with a pounding heart, it sounded like condemnation. Her sobs ceased abruptly, replaced by a silent terror that widened her eyes. She looked from Alexander to the social worker, her face pale under the dim lamplight. The shelter. It was the word the children in the neighborhood used in frightened whispers. The place where children went who had no one left. It was the end of everything she knew. "No!" The word burst from her lips, small but fierce. "I won't go. I want to stay with Alexander. He's my... She stopped. The word Dad dying in her throat. She couldn't use that lie again. Not in front of this woman writing everything down on her clipboard. "He takes care of me," she finished, her voice a thread of desperation. Alexander acted instinctively. He stepped forward, placing himself protectively between Leah and Miss Davis. His mind, trained to find solutions under pressure, worked at dizzying speed. He couldn't allow them to take Leah. The image of the girl in an orphanage, a number in a system, was unbearable. "Miss Davis," he said, his voice calm and controlled, the same one he used to soothe panic-stricken investors during a market crash. "I understand your position and the need to follow protocol. However, taking the child to an unfamiliar environment at this moment of trauma would be extremely detrimental. I will take responsibility for her. I have the resources, a safe home. She can stay with me until her grandmother recovers." The social worker raised an eyebrow, impassive. "Mr. Sterling, with all due respect, you have no legal kinship with the minor. Your good intentions and your financial resources, while notable, do not grant you custody rights. The law is clear. I cannot leave her in the care of a stranger, especially one who is already the subject of an investigation." The cold logic of the law was an insurmountable wall. Every argument Alexander presented was countered with a regulation, a paragraph from the child statute. Meanwhile, the ambulance departed, taking Grandma Elsie and leaving a heavy silence behind. The night was falling outside, and the shadows inside the house seemed to grow, swallowing the remnants of hope. Alexander felt a helplessness he hadn't experienced since he was a young man, struggling to build his first business. All his money, all his influence, his vast fortune were useless in the face of that bureaucratic impasse. It was then that a new element, sordid and unexpected, entered the scene. A neighbor, the same one who had spread the worst rumors, approached the open door, drawn by the commotion. Seeing the social worker, he smiled maliciously. "Well, ma'am, they finally came to see what's going on. That one," he pointed at Alexander with his chin, "keeps showing up here. Nobody knows what he wants with the girl, but it ain't good." The intervention was pure venom, thrown into an open wound. For Ms. Davis, it was confirmation of her suspicions. The anonymous complaint gained a face, a voice. Alexander's situation was complicated by the second. He was a rich stranger, now publicly accused of having suspicious intentions, attempting to gain custody of a child with whom he had no blood ties. His image, previously that of a benefactor, was being tarnished, transformed into that of a potential exploiter. The battle was no longer just about compassion. It had become a fight for his own reputation. And at the center of it all, Leah watched, trembling, the fate of her life being decided by adults who barely knew her, trapped in a nightmare she didn't create. The neighbor's poison sealed the fate of the night. For Miss Davis, the scene fit perfectly into the manual of risk cases. A vulnerable child, an elderly and incapacitated guardian, and a rich man with a sudden, inexplicable interest. The scale of bureaucracy tipped toward precaution. "The decision is made," she said, her voice firm, picking up her clipboard. "Leah will come with me. It is for her safety." She held out her hand to the girl, a gesture meant to be comforting, but which felt like a threat. Leah recoiled, bumping against Alexander's legs like a frightened small animal. The panic in her eyes was a silent plea that screamed louder than any words. It was at that moment that Alexander Sterling, the hesitant philanthropist, vanished, and Alexander Sterling, the ruthless magnate who built an empire from nothing, took his place. The helplessness evaporated, replaced by a cold, concentrated determination. He couldn't break the law, but he knew, better than anyone, how to bend it to his favor. He pulled out his cell phone, a state-of-the-art device that controlled his businesses and his vast capital. His fingers moved with impressive speed and precision. He didn't call an assistant or manager. He called Marcus Thorne, his personal attorney, a man whose ferocity in court was as legendary as Alexander's skill on the stock market. "Marcus," Alexander's voice was low, but charged with unquestionable authority. "I need an injunction, now. Emergency temporary custody of a minor. The name is Leah Alves. The grandmother has been hospitalized. Child Services wants to take her to a shelter. Stop it. Use every resource. I don't care about the cost." On the other end of the line, there were no questions, just a "consider it done." Mrs. Davis watched the scene, a mixture of irritation and surprise on her face. She was used to dealing with desperate families, not billionaires who had the best lawyers in the country on speed dial. Less than 20 minutes later, while she was still trying to convince Leah to grab a coat, her own cell phone rang. It was her supervisor. The conversation was short, and when Ms. Davis hung up, her expression was one of resigned annoyance. "You have very efficient lawyers, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice tight. "They secured a temporary restraining order. The girl can remain in your custody at this residence for 48 hours until a preliminary hearing. But I will return tomorrow morning for an assessment, and know that this," she looked around the humble house, "only heightens suspicions about your motives." She left, leaving behind a silence charged with tension and a fragile victory. Alexander knelt in front of Leah, who was still trembling. He held her small shoulders and made her look at him. "Leah, listen. I know you're scared, but I made you a promise at school, remember? That I'd be your dad for a day. Now I'm making you another promise. I won't let anyone take you, ever." His eyes, which Leah had always seen as serious and distant, were filled with a fierce emotion, a promise worth more than all the gold and dollars in his vaults. While Alexander was making the vow that would seal his destiny, in a noisy newsroom on the other side of the city, a journalist named Ethan Riley, known for his nose for scandal, received a call. The source was anonymous, but the voice was bitter and full of resentment. It was a former fund manager from one of Alexander's companies, fired for fraudulent trading. "I have a story for you," the man said, "about Alexander Sterling and his new obsession, a little orphan girl. He's dumping money on her, trying to buy the kid. They say he never got over losing his own daughter." Ethan smelled a sensational headline. The story had everything: wealth, power, mystery. And the vulnerability of a child? He began typing, the words forming quickly on the screen, weaving a distorted and dangerous narrative. Alexander's private battle was about to explode into a public spectacle. The next morning dawned grey and damp, reflecting the somber mood that had settled over the small house in the Heights. Alexander had spent the night in an uncomfortable armchair, watching over the restless sleep of Leah, who had fallen asleep on the sofa. Exhausted by crying and fear, for the first time in decades, he wasn't thinking about stock quotes, return on investment, or his company's cash flow. His mind was entirely consumed by the imminent battle. The legal victory the previous night had only been a containment maneuver, a temporary postponement of the threat. The real fight would begin at the hearing. Early in the morning, the news exploded, not on television, but in the ruthless universe of the internet. Ethan Riley's article went viral. The magnate and the orphan, philanthropy or obsession, screamed the headline, accompanied by a long lens photo of Alexander in front of Leah's humble house. The text was a masterpiece of poisonous insinuation. It mixed facts, Alexander's wealth, the aid to the family, with the malicious speculation of the former employee. The article briefly and exploitatively mentioned Alexander's personal tragedy, the loss of his daughter, Sophia. Years ago, in a tragic domestic accident, the piece suggested he was trying to replace his lost daughter, a whim of a billionaire who believed his entire fortune could buy anything, even a child's innocence. The impact was immediate and devastating. Alexander's phones didn't stop ringing. Business partners, board members of his companies, everyone wanted explanations. The value of his stocks began to fluctuate at the market opening, a direct reflection of the distrust the story generated. His reputation, carefully built on an image of integrity and business genius, was being tarnished by a sensationalist narrative. What was a private act of compassion had turned into a public scandal. At the hospital, a nurse read the news on her phone and showed it to a colleague, next to the bed where Grandma Elsie was recovering from successful hip surgery. Elsie heard fragments of the conversation, words like exploitation, billionaire, and orphan. A cold panic seized her. Could it be true? Did this man, who had seemed like an angel, have other intentions? The doubt, planted by the media, began to germinate in her tired heart, adding to the physical pain. The official investigation, meanwhile, deepened with new vigor. Ms. Davis returned, this time accompanied by a psychologist. They needed documents, proof. It was during this search, in an old metal box where Elsie kept her few important papers, that the second major twist came to light. Among her social security forms and old bills, there was a handwritten account that Elsie had never had the courage to officially register, a detailed narrative of how she had found Leah. The yellowed, fragile paper confirmed what she had told Alexander, but the legal implication was an earthquake. Since Elsie had never formalized the guardianship, for all legal purposes, Leah was not her granddaughter. She had no known relatives. She was officially an orphan and a ward of the state. This discovery changed everything. Elsie's position as guardian, already fragile, collapsed completely. Now the decision was no longer about where Leah would stay while her grandmother recovered. The issue was about the girl's permanent destiny. The threat was no longer a temporary shelter, but an orphanage, possibly in another city, far from the only home and the only person she had ever known as family. The state, now her legal guardian, had total power, and public opinion, poisoned by the media, saw Alexander not as a savior, but as a danger from which Leah needed to be protected. The door to a future with Alexander seemed to be closing for good. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week, an agonizingly short deadline that Marcus Thorne, Alexander's attorney, described as a legal minefield. The courthouse was a gray, imposing building whose cold corridors seemed to suck out all hope. Alexander felt more out of place there than in Leah's humble home. In his world, the power of money opened all doors. Here, he was just another defendant in a case, and his vast fortune seemed more like a liability than an asset, the supposed proof of his bad intentions. The courtroom was small and stuffy. On one side, Alexander and Marcus in their impeccable suits. On the other, Miss Davis and a prosecuting attorney, a young man with an ambitious look who saw the case as an opportunity for distinction. And at the center of it all, invisible but omnipresent, was Leah's fate. The girl, by court order, had been placed under the temporary custody of a certified foster family to avoid any undue influence from Alexander. The separation had been painful, a reenactment of the abandonment Leah so feared. Alexander could only speak to her by phone, in short, monitored calls, during which the girl's voice sounded increasingly distant and frightened. The prosecutor attacked with the fury of someone who had already formed a verdict. He used the newspaper headlines as his main weapon, painting Alexander as an emotional predator, a man using his wealth to manipulate a system and satisfy a personal whim. "What we have here, Your Honor," he said, his voice echoing in the room, "is not an act of charity, but an act of possession. A man who believes that his bank account, filled with stock profits and perhaps even speculative bitcoins, gives him the right to purchase a child to fill the void in his life." Marcus countered every accusation with facts and logic. He presented receipts for the house repairs, Elsie's doctor's report, testimonies from Mrs. Albright about Alexander's behavior at the school party. But the prosecutor's narrative was more powerful because it appealed to fear and distrust. And then came the most devastating blow. The prosecutor called an unexpected witness, the psychologist who had interviewed Leah. With a professional, neutral voice, the psychologist described Leah as a child, highly suggestible, with a tendency toward fantasy as a defense mechanism. She recounted how Leah had invented the story of the adventurer father. The minor, the psychologist concluded, demonstrates an affective deficiency so profound that she is capable of attaching herself to any figure who offers the slightest attention, making her extremely vulnerable to manipulation. In other words, Leah's affection for Alexander wasn't genuine. It was a symptom of her trauma. His kindness was, in the court's view, the tool of manipulation. Alexander felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. They were using Leah's pain, her imagination, her desperate need for love, against her, against him. Every gesture of affection he had offered was being twisted, turned into proof of his guilt. He looked at the judge, an older man with a tired face who seemed burdened by the weight of the decision. And it was in the judge's eyes that Alexander saw the most terrible truth. He was losing. It was then that the prosecutor, in his closing argument, delivered the coup de grace. He brought up the death of Sophia, Alexander's daughter, in a cruel and calculated way. "We cannot allow Mr. Sterling's personal tragedy to become another child's tragedy. He is not trying to save Leah. He is trying to save himself." At that moment, something inside Alexander broke. The pain he had kept locked away for years, the guilt and grief over the loss of his daughter, surged to the surface with overwhelming force. He remembered the silence of his gigantic apartment, the uselessness of his fortune in the face of loss. And for the first time, he understood. The prosecutor was right about one thing. He was trying to save himself, but not in the way the prosecutor thought. Leah, with her courage and her desperation, had given him a purpose, a chance at redemption, to transform his pain into something good. But now, the very system meant to protect the girl was about to rip that chance away from him and, worse, plunge Leah back into the darkness from which he had tried to rescue her. The hearing was adjourned. The final decision on custody would be announced in 48 hours. The judge left the room, but the sentence of hopelessness already hung in the air. The 48 hours that followed the hearing were the longest and darkest of Alexander Sterling's life. The drive back from the courthouse was a blur of concrete and glass, the outside world muted and colorless. He locked himself in his luxurious penthouse, but the vast, silent space became a torture chamber. Every piece of art, every designer furniture item, every panoramic view of the city seemed to mock his helplessness. What good was a financial empire, a fortune that could move nations, if he couldn't protect a single 7-year-old girl? His assets, his net worth, all seemed like dust, insignificant in the face of the crushing failure he felt in his soul. For the first time, he understood the true nature of bankruptcy. It was not the loss of money, but the loss of hope. On the night before the final decision, the phone rang. It was the monitored call, the only connection he had left with Leah. Her voice on the other end was a fragile whisper, devoid of the vivacity he loved so much. "Alexander," she said, and the use of his first name instead of Dad was like a stab in his heart. "I'm here, Leah, I'm here," he replied, his throat tight. There was a pause, and he could hear her trembling breath. "The lady taking care of me said tomorrow the judge will decide. She said that I'm going to a new place, far away from here." Her voice broke. "Oh, is it true? Are you going to let them take me?" The question hit him with the force of a wave. He, the man who had promised never to leave her, was failing. "Leah, I am fighting. I swear But you lost, didn't you?" She interrupted him, with the cruelly honest perception of a child. "Like the egg race, you lost. I don't want to go anywhere else. I want you." The call was terminated by the supervisor. Alexander held the silent phone, the echo of Leah's words resonating in his mind. "You lost!" In that instant, the pain and resignation that paralyzed him transformed into a cold, focused fury. He hadn't built his empire by accepting defeat. He wouldn't start now. A glacial clarity took the place of despair. He knew what he had to do. It would be the biggest risk of his life, a gamble involving not only his capital, but his very identity. He called Marcus. "Prepare the documents for my resignation from the board chairmanship immediately, and call a press conference for tomorrow morning in front of Willow Creek Elementary." Marcus almost choked. "Alexander, are you insane? This will destroy the stock value, your fortune. It's corporate suicide. The only asset I care about is about to be liquidated by the state," Alexander replied, his voice cutting. "Just do it." The next morning, a CPS car pulled up in front of the school. Ms. Davis got out, her face grim. She was there to execute the court order, which, as expected, mandated Leah's removal to a state-run children's home. A small group of reporters, including Ethan Riley, was already present, smelling the dramatic finale to their story. Ms. Davis entered the principal's office, where Leah waited, small and resigned in her chair. "Leah, honey, it's time to go," she said, as gently as she could manage. The moment she extended her hand to the girl, the school doors burst open. Alexander Sterling entered, not as a defeated man, but as a force of nature. Ignoring Ms. Davis, he walked into the grounds, where the cameras swung to him in a frenzy. He stopped under the same old oak tree where he had talked to Leah. "I have a statement." His voice, amplified by a megaphone one of his aides handed him, echoed throughout the grounds. "Effective immediately, I am resigning control of all my companies. I am placing all my assets and holdings into a blind trust to be administered by third parties, and I will submit to any investigation, no matter how invasive. You want the truth? You want transparency? You will have it, but know this." He turned and pointed toward the principal's door, where Leah now stood, watching him with wide eyes. The reason for every one of my actions in the last few days is not on a spreadsheet or a stock market report. It's right there, and I am not going anywhere without her." Alexander's act was a bolt from the blue. The public resignation, the surrender of his vast empire, was a move so radical and unprecedented that it left everyone, the media, the officials, the business world, in shock. Ethan Riley, the journalist, lowered his camera, his expression of cynicism replaced by pure perplexity. The story he was covering had just transcended scandal. It had become something epic, a renunciation of power for a reason money couldn't buy. Ms. Davis, standing at the principal's door, hesitated. The court order in her hand suddenly felt fragile, inadequate for the magnitude of what was happening. That extreme gesture was the turning point. Public opinion, previously so skeptical, instantly swung. The story was no longer about an eccentric billionaire. It was about a man willing to sacrifice everything for a child. The predator narrative collapsed, replaced by that of a protector. Social media exploded with messages of support. The hashtag #DadFolia became the top trending topic in the country. The judge on the case, bombarded by media attention and the shift in public perception, agreed to reopen the hearing. The second hearing was a world apart from the first. The prosecutor, previously so aggressive, now seemed cornered, his narrative stripped of credibility. Marcus, Alexander's lawyer, presented his client's sacrifice as the final, irrefutable proof of his intentions. What man, he argued, would give up a fortune, a lifetime's legacy built on hard work, for a mere whim? This is not an investment, Your Honor. This is love. The kind of love that defines a family. Alexander, now without the weight of his empire on his shoulders, spoke with a humility and sincerity that silenced the courtroom. He didn't talk about his net worth, about interest or dividends. He spoke about loneliness, about the loss of his daughter Sophia and the emptiness that wealth could never fill. "Leah didn't give me a chance to replace my daughter," he said. His voice choked for the first time. She gave me a chance to learn how to be a father again. She saved me, Your Honor, not the other way around." The crucial testimony, however, came from Grandma Elsie. Brought to the courtroom in a wheelchair, recovered and lucid, she spoke with the simple wisdom of her 85 years. She recounted how Alexander had fixed her roof, bought her medicine, and most importantly, how he had made Leah laugh in a way she hadn't laughed in a long time. "No, a bad man doesn't make a child laugh like that," she concluded, looking directly at the judge. Finally, against all protocols, the judge asked to speak with Leah, alone in his chambers. No one knew exactly what was said, but when they returned, the judge's eyes were moist. He sat down, cleared his throat, and announced his decision. He granted Alexander temporary custody, with a rigorous schedule of psychosocial monitoring, paving the way for a formal adoption process. A wave of relief and discreet applause swept the room. The legal battle, which had cost Alexander a significant portion of his fortune in fees and stock market losses, was won. He left the courtroom and found Leah waiting for him in the hallway. She ran into his arms, and he lifted her into the air, hugging her tightly, his face buried in her hair. "I didn't lose," he whispered in her ear. "We didn't lose." Months later, the adoption process was finalized. On the day Leah Sterling's birth certificate was issued, she was no longer an orphan. She had a father. Her second victory, the most important of all, was not won with money, but with sacrifice. And it was during a visit to the school, seeing other children with the same solitary look she used to have, that the final idea began to take shape. "Dad," she said, holding his hand, "there are more kids like me here, you know, who don't have anyone at the party." That innocent thought planted the seed of the final and most lasting victory of their journey. 5 weeks had passed since that desperate encounter in front of the school. 5 weeks that felt like a lifetime, full of battles, tears, and finally, a newfound peace. The grounds of Willow Creek Elementary were festive once again, but this time, the atmosphere was different. It wasn't a traditional celebration, but the inauguration of something new, something born of pain and hope. The morning sun shone on a newly painted sign near the entrance, Family Support Center, where no child is alone. Alexander and Leah arrived hand in hand. He no longer wore the expensive, impersonal suits. He wore a simple linen shirt and jeans, looking lighter, more approachable. Leah wore a new dress, a vibrant yellow like the sun, but her eyes held the same sweetness and depth as always. They were no longer the billionaire and the orphan, but simply father and daughter, returning to the place where everything began, not to relive a lie, but to celebrate a truth. The social program they created together was the materialization of their journey. With some of the funds Alexander recovered after reorganizing his businesses, he established a foundation. The center at the school offered educational reinforcement, psychological support, and most importantly, a mentorship program where community volunteers committed to accompanying vulnerable children to school events so that no other child would feel the loneliness Leah had felt. It was an investment that yielded no financial profit, but whose return in smiles and transformed futures was incalculable. Mrs. Albright greeted them with a warm hug, her eyes shining with pride. Grandma Elsie was there, sitting in a place of honor, her health visibly restored, chatting animatedly with other grandparents. Even some of the neighbors who previously whispered with distrust were now helping to serve cake and juice, their attitudes transformed by Alexander's example. The scandal had dissolved, replaced by a story of overcoming and generosity that inspired the entire community. As Alexander spoke briefly at the inauguration, talking not about inheritance or compound interest, but about the value of time and affection, Leah watched the grounds. She saw a shy little boy huddled in a corner and recognized in him the same shadow she had carried for so long. She approached him slowly. "Hi," she said, with a gentle smile. "What's your name?" Alexander finished his speech and looked for her. He saw her talking to the boy and then pulling him by the hand toward the game table, introducing him to other children. In that simple gesture, he saw the cycle complete. The girl who had been rescued was now rescuing others. The pain she had felt was not in vain. It had transformed into empathy, into a force for good. Later, sitting under the same old oak tree, Leah rested her head on Alexander's shoulder. The aroma of coffee cake and cut grass, which once nauseated her, was now the smell of home, of security. She looked at his face, at the lines that seemed softer, at the smile that was now genuine and constant. "Dad," she whispered, testing the word that was now hers, real and unwavering. "Do you think we can help all of them?" Alexander hugged her, his heart overflowing with a kind of wealth he had never known. He looked at the vibrant grounds, at the children running and laughing, at the sign that promised a better future. The school party that began with a desperate lie had become the foundation of a family and a legacy. He had learned that true fatherhood was not in the ties of blood, but in the willingness to sacrifice everything for the one you love. And she, the girl who once had to invent a father, discovered she no longer needed fantastic stories. She could build her own family, her own truth, based on the genuine love that arose from the most improbable request and transformed two lives forever. "Yes, my daughter," he replied, his voice firm with a new conviction. "I think we can try."